Right, let's get going. So thank you first to my panelists, and then we have some audience members that are still moving from room to room, so we know that folks will continue to trickle in, but we're gonna get started so that we have this full hour because we have so much to cover on this panel. My name is Nicole Jolly, the Vice President for Strategy and Engagement with the Urban League of Louisiana, and you are at our session that will focus on advancing equity in workforce and wages. As I said, that's a lot to cover, but our panelists are well prepared to talk through this topic from a variety of angles. So I'm going to start by just framing this up by the potential. So by 2050, Metro New Orleans stands to realize a $43 billion gain in economic output by closing the racial equity gap. We will talk more about what that means, but it includes full engagement of the workforce, which Louisiana currently does not have. In every indicator assessing the educational and economic status of major racial and ethnic groups in Louisiana, African Americans rank at the bottom in educational achievement and attainment, employment, livable wages. And this panel will discuss some of the ways that we can address these disparities and create particularly systems level and policy change so that we have a stronger state overall. We'll be sharing some findings and recommendations from a policy brief that the Urban League is preparing to release and dig into a lot more that is also connected to our Sea Change Collective initiative, which may come up in today's session as well. So before we get into the session, I'm going to start by introducing our panelists. And I will start we'll go alphabetical order. I'll start with you, my colleague, Cherie LaCour-Duckworth. If you could just say hello to the audience.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon.
Thank you. And then we have Lamar Gardier, Executive Director of the Data Center.
Good afternoon, everyone. How's it going?
Jan Muller, Executive Director of the Louisiana Budget Project.
Good afternoon, everybody. Great to be here.
Hey, Jan. And John Warner Smith. This is actually probably John's first engagement as an official team member of the Urban League of Louisiana, our new Education Policy Director.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon.
Thanks, John. And then last but certainly not least, Patrick Young, who is the Director of the Office of Gun Violence Prevention, Office of Command Control. This is our mic check. Hey, Pat. We are having trouble hearing you, at least I can't hear. So you're not muted, but there may be some other issue. We can work on that. But let's jump in. I'm gonna start by going to John Warner Smith to give us some of the high level findings from the research that you did on workforce equity that we will all be looking for in the policy brief, but if you could kind of frame us up by giving us some of the high points that we can expect to see in that report.
Be happy to, Nicole. Well, the policy brief really sort of focuses on inequities and disparities in the workforce. And in doing so, of course, we had to look at a number of areas, indicators, key indicators. You mentioned in your intro that in every indicator, measuring the economic status and educational attainment of African Americans of all racial and ethnic groups in Louisiana, African Americans rank at the very bottom. And these include, as you mentioned, secondary and post-secondary education, poverty levels, employment in the labor force, and livable wages. So I won't go into detail in the interest of time of those outcomes, but I will say that the second really key finding that we uncovered is that there are barriers to racial equity that pose severe threats to the economic well-being of African Americans in Louisiana. These barriers include limited transportation, lack of access to high quality early care and education, and there are statutory restrictions as many of us know, on the ability of individuals with criminal histories to find work, get work, and to be self-employed. Those were, in sort of in broad buckets, the key, the two primary findings, right? Now, in response to the data and there's a lot of data in this report, we recommend 4 sets of policy changes, 4 sets of policies. And these 4 sets of changes, I'm going to basically lay them out. I'm going to read them to make sure that that our viewers get them. But I want to say that in each of these policy change sets, we have also provided detailed objectives that will enable us, if we carry these things out, to actually accomplish these changes. In addition, we identify whether these changes require legislative or executive action at the state level, of course, in collaboration with the private sector and with key stakeholders in the state. So the 4 sets of policy changes are as follows. Number 1, establish system-wide workforce equity goals in state government. Widely communicate those goals, plans, and outcomes to the general public, and engage key stakeholders. This is very important, that we engage key stakeholders across the state in designing data-driven strategies to achieve equity. The second set of policy recommendations recommends that we address racial disparities in post-secondary and secondary education with bolder, much more aggressive policies and strategies to close these equity gaps. And the report, lays out really a broad range of outcomes in education, in post-secondary and secondary educational attainment and achievement. The third is to enact policies and strategies really just to build a more skilled and income stable labor force of workers of color. There's a whole section of the report that deals with African Americans, the status of African Americans in the Louisiana labor force. And we absolutely must begin to just do a better job, be more aggressive in building a skilled labor force of people of color. And lastly, to address what we call social determinants. I mentioned some of these barriers earlier, barriers that hinder our ability to advance and achieve equity in the state workforce. So the Urban League believes that if we would implement these 4 broad strategies in the detail within them, that we'll build stronger families, a stronger economy, and of course improve the quality of life for all people of Louisiana, but particularly for African Americans.
Thank you, John, for taking the time to kind of set that stage for us, because each of our other panelists want to have a chance to kind of hone in on some of what you shared. And we'll start by going to Mr. Gardier, who has, the data center has so much research that you all have done over the years on equitable workforce as well as wages. But we're going to ask you to share a bit about some of what you believe are the most important things to consider related to increasing equity in the workforce.
Sure, I can do that. Thank you, Nicole, and thank you in particular to both Unico and Urban League in the data center to what has been a great conference so far. We appreciate it and are happy to contribute to it. So when we look at the workforce and wages systems here in New Orleans, I think 2 things stand out pretty immediately as issues of concern. One is that our economy lacks diversity in terms of its industries, meaning that we are dominated by a single industry, mainly hospitality. Healthcare follows up as the second most numerous industry, but hospitality really does dominate things. In any economy across the entire country, typically struggles when an industry that is typically filled with low wages is what leads your economy in terms of it offering the most jobs to its residents. And so there's almost no surprise that we struggle in terms of wages in that regard. You know, what we know is that hospitality, there are some high wage jobs in hospitality, but most of them are lower wage jobs. You know, that are where the majority of the lower wage jobs do go to people of color. There's difficulty in terms of career advancement in the industry. In fact, one study shows that after 10 years, only 1 in 10 had received a promotion over the course of their career in that industry. Very difficult to move forward there. And you know, sometimes the narratives related to the industry don't match reality, right? The narrative is sort of, you know, that hospitality, you know, people who work in restaurants and things like that. These are mostly young folks who are taking these jobs. Maybe it's their first job out of college, or it's, you know, pocket change while they're in college, things like that. But the reality is that 50% of the folks working these jobs are between the ages of 25 and 44, meaning that they are likely to have children, likely to be supporting a family, and the low wages from this industry simply do not support that ability to support families. The second thing that really stands out about our labor force in particular, and this is really important, that when you look at the sort of New Orleans' history over the last 50 years or so, we start to have trouble in about the 70s or 80s in our economy. And what you see is from 1980 to 1990, the number of jobs for the employment levels for all men, Hispanic, white, and Black, dipped significantly during that decade. During the oil bust, and as the port was having troubles, and as union membership began to decline. And what you see starting in the 1990s is employment start to rebound for all of those groups except for Black men. For Black men, employment continues to decline all the way through to current day, and never rebound at all. And so we see many of the issues that are with us today being related to low Black male employment. Again, a problem that started in the 80s, and the jobs that replaced the lost jobs in the 80s, primarily those that were hospitality, did not do well to replace or to improve the circumstances of employment for Black males. And so what we end up setting up here in our economy is a set of mutually reinforcing problems. Particularly, the workforce system is not serving African-American men well to get back into the workforce. Relatedly, we have incarceration rates, even former incarceration rates, that are far too high and don't facilitate people getting back to the workforce. The education system in New Orleans is not adequate to provide the kinds of skills and education that would be required for higher level, higher paying jobs. There's a lack of diversity, again, in our economy related to good jobs, right? Good job is a term of art in this conversation that speaks to what that job can provide in terms of benefits and salaries and things like that. And the wage floor in terms of our economy is simply too low to lift large numbers of people out of poverty. And that's what the data shows us related to the workforce and wages.
Thanks, LaMar. And there's a lot that you brought up that we'll continue to touch on with our other panelists. And after we get to hear from each of you, we will dig into the wages conversation, which we obviously can't have without talking about state minimum wage and the industries. So we'll be coming back to all of that. I want to go next to Pat. Think your mic is working now? We do a quick check.
We are, mic check.
Lovely, wonderful. So you bring a unique perspective on multiple levels that I'm hoping you'll bring to this response. You've done a lot of work, obviously, in your current role, but also in previous roles with individuals who have trouble accessing work and self-sustaining wages. You also know firsthand how incarceration impacts the workforce and ultimately our community's well-being. How does policy impact access to work and wages for people specifically returning from incarceration, given where we are in Louisiana and our high numbers of folks who are returning?
Great question. Thanks for having me. Who dat, first of all, everybody, who dat, New Orleans. Just right directly answering, I would want to go back to our first conversation here in 2019 when this policy started here with the Urban League, and which was great to have this conversation around this policy dealing with individuals with backgrounds having barriers to employment. So in that policy, in that forum, we discussed how there were 389 restrictions for somebody with a conviction getting access to employment. By having a conversation again in 2019, it brought the attention not only locally, but to the state level. And I'm glad to report out last year in June of 21, I don't know if people were paying attention, but House Bill 707 passed. Act 406 now makes it almost illegal to discriminate against someone with a conviction. And it was a big push in that policy from the discussion that we had in 2019 and say, why do we have so many restrictions to employment? And one of them was found that there was some discriminatory acts by employers of someone with a conviction. So this supersedes the whole ban of boxing and make employers give more access to people with convictions. It's the first step. And so policy creates the dialogue and allows us to have this continual access of solving issues that we have. And if we have an issue where we have one of the largest amount of workforce deficits, meaning that we have all these vacant opportunities for people to work. We have people who are returning home from incarceration who needs to work. So where is the disconnect? And to know that there is something, a policy already in place that's preventing it, then let's create the policy that can open it back up. And it was key for us to have that discussion again in 2019, but it's also the reward of the work that we're doing here in support of with the Urban League to say that the discussions now have to have deliverables and outcomes. And one of those outcomes has been from the discussion is the passing of Act 406 last year. So we want to hope that we can continue along with these discussions and have more things brought to the table so we can attack the policy and make the reform changes necessary. Since then, with the Office of Gun Violence Prevention, we've worked with partners like CEO and Troy Glover and his camp, and we've been able to help bring over 175 individuals into the employment work readiness training field, but we found that only 2 people were recidivists. So when you look at the numbers of what it means to give someone access to employment, and if the national standard is every 3 out of 4 returns within 3 years, if this program is showing effective that we can have over 175 individuals, but only 2 return, then there's promise when we have people get access to employment opportunities. Not only does it improve the livelihood of the individual, but the family, and the family can then return, improve the community. So I thank the Urban League for having a discussion, because when it was brought up, then there was a lot of oohs and ahs because people didn't know, but then the action to follow through is key. So I appreciate you and the Urban League for having enough gall to take it on. And now we have good legislation to say that people who have made a mistake like myself deserves the opportunity to contribute back to society.
Thanks, Pat. And yeah, we'll be coming back to this, the conversation around policy, given that we are just starting the legislative session this week. So we'll come back to policy, and I want to see if some of the other panelists might have something to respond to, given what you just shared too, Pat. So let's go to Jan next. The Louisiana Budget Project has a long time been a champion, you in particular, in pushing for fair wages at the state level. Can you help us understand why it has been such a challenge and also we know there are other models exist. So what other examples can we learn from, and what can we keep trying to do to make this happen in Louisiana?
Sure. Well, thank you, first of all, for having me. It's an honor to be here, and it's always tough to follow LaMar, who and others who I admire greatly. But I want to build on something LaMar said about the composition of New Orleans workforce, which is so heavily concentrated in hospitality and healthcare, and that kind of underscores a reality here in this state, which is that most everybody in Louisiana and New Orleans, most households have people who work, go to work every day. The problem is that the jobs that they have, particularly in hospitality and some in healthcare, just don't pay enough. And so, sometimes solutions are very complicated to problems we face, but I think on wages, some of the problems are really not as difficult as we make them out. Louisiana is one of 5 states in the entire country without any minimum wage law on its books. We have the highest percentage of workers in the country who make the minimum wage. The federal minimum wage is the minimum wage in Louisiana. It's $7.25 an hour, and it has not gone up since 2009. And it's one of the reasons why Louisiana, in addition to having high rates of poverty, has the 4th highest rate of income inequality in the country. And we know that when we talk about minimum wage and low wage jobs, that we are talking disproportionately about Black and brown workers. And unfortunately, a lot of these jobs, this is where the job growth is. So, we can talk a lot about education and training and specialized skills and technical skills. And I think those are very worthy and important conversations to have. But as long as tourists come to New Orleans, there's going to be a large workforce of people who serve that industry, and we need to make sure these jobs pay better. The good news about the minimum wage is that this is one of the most popular policy options out there. We're a divided country. We hear every day about how divided we are. Every poll I've ever seen on the minimum wage finds broad popular support. It cuts across racial lines, it cuts across party lines. And every time people have actually voted on the minimum wage around the country, they have approved raising the minimum wage. So this is not something that the public is skeptical of. People understand that a job needs to pay more than $7.25 an hour. There's also, there's a myth out there that, if you raise the minimum wage, then that's going to kill jobs. I'm only going to say there have been Nobel Prizes in economics won by people who proved that it does not kill jobs if the wage increases are modest. And one of the examples I love to cite is the state of Arkansas. In Arkansas, they had citizen referendums. They put the minimum wage on the ballot, and twice the people of Arkansas raised the minimum wage. And one of the things that happened in Arkansas, and we can't say that it is absolutely directly related to this, but one of the things that Arkansas happened, Annie E. Casey Foundation every year puts out the Kids Count rankings, where they rank how children are doing in a state. And Arkansas, after raising the minimum wage, they actually improved significantly on the Kids Count ranking. Louisiana has been 48th, 49th, or 50th on this ranking for the last 25 years or so. Arkansas actually moved up significantly, and on economic well-being, they moved up like 12 slots from 47th to 35th. So when you raise wages for parents, then their children do better. You are really investing not just in the workers, but the families. So the bad news is, there's 3 ways to raise the minimum wage. The first is, get the legislature to do it. We have tried this. This will be my 11th year in a row going to the legislature to ask them to raise the minimum wage. Unfortunately, the House Labor Committee at the legislature has traditionally been very hostile to this idea. So even though it has broad popular support, the business lobby manages to kill this every time. The second way that we have also tried, not as many times, is to abolish a state law that prevents local governments from raising the wage on their own. This is called preemption, and Louisiana was the first state in the country to pass a preemption law. So even if New Orleans wanted to pass a minimum wage ordinance, or Baton Rouge wanted to do that, state law prevents that. So we could, we've tried going to the state legislature and say, hey, if you don't want to raise the wage, let's let local communities vote on it. That hasn't been able to gain traction. And the third thing, which we haven't really tried, which I think would be very difficult, but worth a shot, is let citizens do it. Louisiana does not have a citizen referendum process. Only the legislature can put a constitutional amendment on the ballot, and that requires a 2/3 vote. So hopefully at one point, the legislature will change that and let citizens have a referendum process so we could put it on the ballot. Because if there's one thing I know, I'm almost certain of, is that if we could bring a minimum wage to the vote, a vote of the people of Louisiana, then we would vote to raise wages, and that would immediately not just lift the wages of people making minimum wage, people making a little bit above the minimum wage who also would see pay increases. This is something that would really change a lot of people's lives significantly and lift people into the middle class. So again, this is not a very complicated idea, but it's something that we could do if we only had the political will to do it in Louisiana.
Thank you for saying that so clearly, Jan. I will take the moment of hope that you, I think, gave us in your remarks that it can be done. We've seen other states do it. We've seen, we always talk about how Louisiana is at the bottom of just about every list. That's where we started this conversation, but it is possible to come up. There are certain things that need to be done and put in place for us to see that come to fruition, though. So, all right, before I go to Cherie, if Pat, if you have something in response to that point, let's hear it.
Yes, I think it's so right on what was just said, because for what I talked about with people with convictions, just imagine you're not even getting an opportunity to access to the minimum. So if the minimum is $725 and you don't even get access to the minimum, then what kind of state are you having this large population of people with convictions in? And so I just want to echo his comments on that. I really appreciate him saying it, but laying it out. But from the group of individuals who I represent, if they're not getting access to the minimum, then what are you giving them? And so I think it's good that we're having this discussion.
Yeah, and I want to come back to this more too. We had a great panel on expungement earlier today, and how important that is to impact the workforce and access to job opportunities as well. So before we come back to that, though, I want to let Cherie enter the conversation here. And we also do work every day, the Urban League, with job seekers. And I want to know what gives you hope. We heard a little bit of hope from Jan's comments. I'm hoping you can give us a little bit more. Over the last 2 years we've really seen, I don't even like the word unprecedented anymore because everything is unprecedented now, but the last 2 years in trying to work with job seekers who are trying to access careers, has been challenging, but are there opportunities that we can and should be taking advantage of?
So yes, there are definitely opportunities that we should be taking advantages of. So what I see from the work of the Urban League that gives me hope is our vision that all Louisianians, especially Black and Brown people, can and will have access to good paying jobs with a living wage and good benefits. Now, part of the reason that we're having the discussions we're having today is to spotlight the inequities that we do see. And so in spotlighting those inequities, we know that we have to build better programs that have inclusion, meaning we are including whether you are just as involved, returning citizen, opportunity youth, or an adult that is, out of work and seeking employment. We're building those pathways for people to come into the workforce to have access to great jobs. And the only way to do that is to make sure that we have the right policies in place so that we can include everyone. As a part of the Urban League's in-house economic engine, we help to create pathways to opportunity for the marginalized individuals. especially those who are returning home after incarceration. And as I said earlier, out of school youth and opportunity youth, who are all too often locked out of opportunities, especially employment and training opportunities. And I believe John mentioned it a little earlier when he talked about over 500,000 adults ages 18 and above have earned less than a high school diploma. You know, and in Louisiana, nearly 1 million more whites than blacks have attained a high school diploma or higher. And so we're putting these programs inside of the schools where our kids can have access to not only a high school education, but they can dual enroll into the colleges so that they can have a chance to access industries that require specific certifications in order to compete for these jobs. So as they graduate from high school, they also have either CTE or a 2-year degree so that they are competitive. And when you think about that, another part of that hope is that it prevents them from making these student loans that we just can't afford to pay back when we get out of college. Because why? We're only going to earn $7.25 an hour, even with a college degree sometimes. You know, we have to change what we see in today's labor force. You know, Patrick talked about it earlier, the $7.25. I mean, in the whole world, there's only 5 states that still follow the federal minimum wage of $7.25. Unbelievable, unbelievable. But again, with our programs that we've put together, especially our apprenticeship programs, you have an opportunity to have access to a job, guaranteed employment. While you're working, you're also earning your income and you're learning the job. And so it makes you more competitive to that employer because they're training you the way they want you to do this particular job. And it's a stackable credential. You know, you can add on to your education and it's also portable. So if you leave one employer, you already have the credential to compete for jobs within other employment agencies. So, you know, we're happy to be here. I'm happy to be here. And thank you to the Urban League for putting on this policy conference.
Thank you. We have some great questions coming in the chat. So I'm going to start with this one. It's directed to you, LaMar, and I think you can start. And if anyone else wants to add, we'll see who else wants to chime in. But the question from Ms. Dixon is, she'd like to hear more about how we can diversify the employment options and mandate livable wages from the tourism industry.
Yes, so thank you for the question. I also dropped a short answer in the chat as well. So there are a couple of things here. One, the tourism industry itself probably has a limited ability to provide the kinds of jobs that we're talking about here, right? You can improve the minimum wage. You could institute more unions or bring back better union membership. That typically does tend to increase wages and gives workers more bargaining power, so there are better benefits and things like that. Greater chance that you won't lose your job, or if you do, you're rehired at some point, won't be laid off. But in general, the industry exists in such a way that it's difficult for it to provide the number of jobs and the types of salaries that are really required. So what we really want to do is expand the economy to start producing better jobs, right? More good jobs. And to do that, you must improve the quality of education broadly in our region, and you must create conditions where people can be lifted out of poverty. Both of those things are actually far more doable than it might seem with some of the legislative action that is out there already. If it were to pass, would help to do those things significantly. And focus on economic development that is not so much based around incentives and tax breaks and things like that, but is focused on people, producing people who live with good quality of life and have skills and are highly qualified. Building that kind of workforce is what attracts other businesses to your region and provides the fuel for entrepreneurs to create new industries, grow, and hire talented folks. So, in short, improve education and remove the legislative shackles from New Orleans so we can do what we need to do.
Thanks, LaMar. And I'm actually wondering, there may be something that Jan wants to add to the second part of her question around what who actually has the power to impact wages. And we so far have really only talked about the legislative, right? Raising a state or putting in place a state minimum wage. There's also the option to have a federal, right, to increase the federal minimum wage. But without those two things happening, how else can we impact wages? And particularly employers, right? The employers are the ones setting the wages. So are there ways that we can be holding employers more accountable? This is a conversation I've had with probably all of you on this panel. So I'm wondering if any of you want to jump in on that.
Nicole, I'll let Jan speak if he's about to jump in there.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, just to add a couple of things, you know, the policy brief, in addition to those things that have already been mentioned, also suggests that we expand registered apprenticeships across the state. And we absolutely have to do a better job with our adult education program. They're doing great work, but we're constrained with two things. Number one, financial resources, and secondly, reaching those adults who are uneducated. It's a big number out there. And we've got to expand our outreach and just be more effective in finding those individuals. If we can find the money to even provide the educational assistance needed. The other thing we can do is really, I think we have some great training programs at the state level, the Louisiana Workforce Commission. And I think we can do a better job with our adult programs in ensuring that African-American workers and African-Americans entering the workforce are really being trained in jobs that are high growth, high demand, and getting the skills that they need to fill the great demand for those skills across the state. So I would just add that to what has already been said.
I would echo everything that Lamar and Mr. Smith said, and I would just add that right now is a really good opportunity to do something about this. If you watch the state legislature, they have about $3.5 billion in surplus dollars, pandemic relief dollars, and kind of excess revenue sitting around. We put out a report just yesterday that recommends some ways to spend that. You know, we hear a lot about, you know, now post-pandemic about a labor shortage. You've heard that phrase a lot. We don't have a labor shortage. We have a high-paying jobs shortage. There's no shortage of people willing to work for $100,000 a year or $50,000 or $75,000 a year. There's a shortage of people who don't want to work for low pay, and that includes professions like, you know, school bus drivers and teachers' aides and paraprofessionals in the schools. There's a lot of jobs that people do that require specialized skill, but that don't pay enough. And so I think state and local governments could use some of the power of the purse to lift the wages of those jobs, not just the jobs that they directly control, but jobs that they indirectly control. For example, you know, through the Medicaid budget, more than 40% of people in Louisiana get their health coverage through the Medicaid program. And the state could certainly require that providers of Medicaid services pay higher wages to the people who perform those services. So there's a lot of things to what Mr. Smith was talking about, worker training programs. The state last year actually created a very strong vocational training called the MJ Foster Promise Program, which provides free education for returning students who want to train in high demand occupations. One thing we could do is set aside money now that we have a surplus to provide wraparound services. So people who want to, you know, if you're training for a new job, you still have to pay the rent, you still have to feed your kids, you still have to take care of your basic necessities. Why not put aside some money to make sure that people have their basic necessities taken care of while they're training for a new job and those higher skills and those higher wages? So there are some tools, you know, short of getting a minimum wage bill through the House Labor Committee, and I'm going to keep trying to do that. I think there are ways that we can use these surplus dollars, this money that we haven't had for almost a generation, to center the people in the communities that have been hurt most by COVID, that have been left behind historically, and to try to lift them up. So we have a really good opportunity. But again, this requires talking to legislators and people making their voice known, because there's a lot of folks coming to Baton Rouge with their hand out asking for a piece of that. And what we've done historically is we've said, let's give it to business. Let's incentivize companies by giving them tax breaks. If we do the same old thing that we've done, we're going to get the same results that we did before.
And also, just to that point, we just got to be mindful of the policies that are created as well, and make sure that the policies work together in conjunction. For instance, there was a law that eliminated slavery, and then right after it eliminated slavery, you created vagabond laws, or Jim Crow laws, that just put people back in bondage, right? When we talk about the laws that are giving opportunities for employment now for people with convictions, then you have restrictions for housing. And the number one concern with people with incarceration isn't just getting employment, but it's housing. You're 10 times as likely to be homeless if you have a conviction. So we have to make sure that when we address these policies, it's across the board that affects the entire system. So when people can return back home, you have access to housing, you have access to employment, but you also have access to resources. And shameless plug, I just recently wrote my first book, A Way Up: Economic Development, Post-Incarceration. You all can get it wherever books are sold. But it speaks to those things, that there has to be a new discussion on economic development for people who are formerly incarcerated and get access to some of those policies right now that are standing up as barriers.
I'm wondering, Patrick, since you went there, is there a specific barrier that you can mention that you actually had, like, can walk us through some of the experience of what that took?
So the main thing, Urban League, you guys have a great work readiness training program when we was doing Stride. But when someone finished the training and they actually get the employment opportunity, now if that individual wants to start their own business, if they want to get their own house, there are some banking policies that they're not allowed to have that access, immediate funding to get a mortgage, to get access to those resources. And so you're stuck now in rental situations where you're overpaying in a poverty area, high crime area. Now you're working though, and you want to move out, but because of some of those restriction practices around housing, you can't move in this neighborhood. And then if you want to get a loan, you're not getting banking support. So when we talk about policies dealing with people with convictions, we have to look at the entire system and make sure that there's a pipeline of support, not just turning one thing. It's great that we're having a discussion and we're saying now, because to John's point and to Lamar's point, I'm thinking that what if you didn't even have access to the minimum? We're just fighting just to get to the minimum, the 725. And then once you get access to that, then you can't get access to housing because of the conviction. And then once you get access to that, what about the banking supporting system? And so it is a step in the right direction. I appreciate legislation for passing House Bill 407. But now let's look at some of those restrictive policies around housing and access to resources that we can make people return with some light, not just one win. We can get wins all across the board.
Thanks, Pat. I'm wondering if anyone else has some response to both Jan and Pat's last comments.
I agree with both of their comments. I don't know that there's anything more to add to it. I think they provide a good perspective on both of these issues. So.
Yeah, I think some of what comes out of, and obviously this is a policy conference, and we did see a lot of legislation that emerged after our legislators attended this conference last year and got to be in conversation with folks like you, folks who are doing work on the ground, and let that inspire them to then submit bills. The policy changes is a first step. There's also accountability, right? And how things actually are implemented. So I'm wondering if there's, let's get to our policy question. I think if there are one or two systems level or policy changes that you would put forward in support of quality workforce and equity in wages, what would you want us all to get behind? One or two policy or systems changes that you would say this is the thing.
Nicole, I'll jump in there. Without a doubt, when we talk about the quality of education, the quality of the workforce, the pipeline really starts at birth, right? And until Louisiana does a better job of funding early care and education, I mean, we've made great strides in the last few years, but there's clearly a need for better access to high quality childcare and early care and education, particularly for poor families. You know, it's proven it's a problem for Black families in two ways. One, Black families are most impacted by their inability to pay for high quality early care and education. And of course, Black children in poverty growing up in a poor household are less likely, without high quality early care and education, to be ready to enter kindergarten and to be successful beyond. So I'm happy to see that the governor has recommended more than $44 million in his budget for more funding that will go into the Child Care Assistance Program and to the LA4 program for rate increases there. And so I would urge the viewers who are here today to contact your legislators and urge them to please vote yes for those appropriations.
Thanks, John.
John, I'd have to echo what you said, but I would also add that, Black and brown people continue to face barriers to good jobs and career pathways. And I feel that eliminating the racial inequities is necessary for people of color to succeed and for the economic growth and prosperity of Louisiana communities. If we put these policies forward that we're talking about and changing these systems that we're trying to change, we can all have good jobs or access to good jobs, and we can all buy a house or be able to pay the rent for whatever house we want to live in. We have to tear down these barriers before we can do anything. If we leave the barriers the way they are, we're going to continue to see what we've been seeing.
Anyone else? If you had your one or two policy changes.
Well, I'll just echo again, I'll fight for housing with people with convictions, like removing some of those barriers and policies for renters, for people that are trying to get in housing situations. It is a challenge like no other when you have a conviction and you just want to find a place to live. And what it forces you to do is get this in this person's name, get this in my girlfriend's name. And then if there's an incident, then now that's a whole nother situation. And we are seeing a lot of the violence and stuff with gun violence. And again, when we talk to victim assistance and what can we do, how can we change their situation if they're been involved in a violent area, they're like, we just need better housing. And well, when we go through the process of the paperwork, the restrictions again are becoming, because most of the people in those areas have convictions as well. So if we can remove some of those housing restrictions, we can move people to better places when they get their jobs and opportunities and provide a better, safe environment for their families to grow in. If they want to make that change, they should have access to it in a sense.
Nicole, and just to add to that, I agree. I would love to see the minimum wage go from $7.25 above to 15 or above. And I say above because when you think about $15 an hour, it's not much money a year, especially if you're trying to buy a home or pay rent. It's just not enough. So we're fighting for $15, and I know it's a start, but we need a little more than that. I said, let's start at 20 so that people can afford to do these things.
Thanks, Cherie. Jan.
Well, I'll echo what what others said. Mr. Smith is right, of course, about early childhood, but I'm going to be a broken record and talk about minimum wage. And I would say, establish a state minimum wage, make it meaningful, whether that's 12 or 15 or higher. In my mind, it needs to be at least 15. That minimum wage needs to be indexed to inflation so that it goes up automatically when the cost of living goes up, and it needs to include a tipped minimum wage. The tipped minimum. Right now, if you are a tipped worker, if you are a server in a restaurant, the minimum wage is $2.13 an hour because you're expected to make up your wages with tips. But we can certainly raise that. There should be no difference between the regular minimum wage and the tipped minimum wage. The most tourist-friendly place in the entire universe, Nevada, Las Vegas, has a tipped minimum wage that's equal to the same minimum wage. So you can certainly have a very thriving tourist industry and still pay tip workers what they deserve. The other thing very quickly that I would do if I had two things is make community and technical college training free. We should have the expectation that school is available, that a free and appropriate public education is available through 2 years of after high school, if you choose to pursue that. And that's something we could do that would not break the bank. I think it would be less than $300 million a year for the state to make those services free.
Thanks, Jan.
Jan, you totally read my mind. Those were two answers that I had. Clearly, the last time we really rethought what was required around education was the earlier 20th century when we decided high school needed to be free and available to everybody. For the 21st century, we need to rethink it again. Community college, even 4-year state colleges should be free at this point to meet needs. But on a couple other things, I'm going to mention state preemption, which I think Jan mentioned earlier. If state preemption were not a thing, not allowed in Louisiana, then New Orleans could pass the kinds of legislation that it requires for its citizenry to be healthy and to be well supported and viable. So that's one of the primary things. Getting rid of state preemption is something that does poll fairly well. So that it should be possible for that shackle to be removed. The other thing that I'm going to mention is a little less of a policy and more of a reflection on our behavior and attitudes. There are a number of bad and unhelpful narratives around Black employment that prevent many folks from getting and being promoted in the jobs that they should in the private sector. Even hiring Black-owned companies as subcontracts. So we do need to develop better practices, behaviors, and even narrative campaigns around changing the way that we think and talk about the value of Black labor in our city. And if we did that, then the industries, the businesses would do far better, and so would our citizens.
Thanks, Amar. And I want to go back to the point you made around minimum wage first, because I'm wondering if you can share a bit more about what that actually looks like statewide, and whether or not it would look the same across the state, the need for a higher minimum wage.
Yeah, so I spent a little bit of time looking at this. When we think about the minimum wage, then you should also think about the living wage, right? Even conversations around a minimum wage at $11 or $12 an hour, that is not nearly the living wage that we see here in New Orleans. The living wage for a single adult is $15 in New Orleans. For a single adult with one child, it is $32 an hour, right? And so the typical conversations around the living wage, the minimum wage, don't always match up with the living wage conversation. But my thought was whether or not high living wage requirements are, maybe it's a city thing, right? It may be not a problem that exists across Louisiana, across urban areas, across suburban areas and things like that. When you look at what the living wage looks like across the entire state, it's actually very, very similar to what Orleans Parish needs, with there only being a couple dollars difference between what rural parts of Louisiana need and what urban areas like New Orleans needs, which means that the minimum wage conversation is one that benefits and is for all of us, not just people in New Orleans, not just people in urban areas. It's not just to make sure Black folks have better wages and things like that. This is actually a conversation that benefits everybody across Louisiana. We would all do better. There'd be lower poverty across the board, Black, white, what have you. This minimum wage conversation, bringing it up to a point where it meets the living wage, is one that is for us all, not just urban, majority, minority areas of the state.
Thanks, LaMar. That was such an important point, that your research, that when you found that, I was like, that's something we need to start saying and making clear that everybody understands that. So thanks for sharing that. I think I saw Leisha's hand go up. Leisha Gooseberry is a part of the work that we do with our Sea Change Collective. And I'm wondering, did you have a final question you wanted to pose, Leisha?
Yes, I did. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Leisha Gooseberry. I want to speak on formerly incarcerated prisoners. I served close to 27 years in prison, and currently I make $12 an hour. I still find it hard to meet all my demands as far as the bills, the rent, the light, the food. I don't know how to drive, so I have to take the bus, and I have a hard time getting I'm not trying to get low income or affordable housing. I mean, if you need the help, there's no help for somebody like me because I want to work. So I have a hard time, and then discouragement sets in, but because of the people that I have behind me to encourage me to keep going forward, someone that doesn't have that group of people around them to encourage them, that'll have that person feeling like, well, I'm not worthy of this, and they'll commit crimes and they'll go and do something wrong. Is there anything we can do for people like that or like me that is in that mode where because you want to work, you can't get assistance? You don't qualify for this, you don't qualify for that. And it's sometimes you just need that little bit of help to get you over it until you get back on your feet. And that is a big problem here in Louisiana. Does that make sense?
You said it makes the most sense, because you're summarizing exactly what our problem is, right? That is exactly the issue that we have. And, in some of our conversations around this, ultimately, people need money in their hands, right? That's just, that is what it is. For people to survive and for us to have a thriving community, that is kind of what it comes down to. And we have so much in place that is keeping that from being a reality. I want to give our panelists a chance to respond, but Leisha, one, I thank you for being here. I thank you for being a part of this work, and thank you for your question. And I
have the video off because I work in a hospital, and you're not allowed. I can't lose this job, but I wanted to be here.
But we're not trying to put that job at risk, Leisha.
No. I know you're not, but I just wanted to explain and elaborate. I would love for you guys to see me, and this program means the world to me.
Thanks, Leisha.
So let me just jump in right quick. So first, it's not coincidence that question came up, and the irony again, I'm gonna go back and plug the book, and I'm gonna make sure that you get a free copy of it, because it is a guidebook.
Thank you.
It's a guidebook for economic development post-incarceration to address everything that you said, because constantly people don't understand the need to get economic development started post-incarceration. So what is the training? What is the guide? What are the steps that you need? And so the book outlines step by step exactly what you would need to do to try to guide you in a better way. The goal isn't to get out of prison, it's to get out of poverty. And that's why the book is called A Way Up, because it's a way up, not just a way out. And so I'll be glad to make sure that you have a copy and give you my information so we could talk offline around just more issues that you're helping, and just kind of guide and walk you through it. But again, it's important that we have these conversations, because when I speak of people who are formerly incarcerated, I'm not speaking for myself, but I'm speaking for all of the thousands of people that are released each year that don't have access to economic opportunity. So I'm so glad that you raised the point. I'm so glad that Urban League is even bold enough to have this discussion, because now we can actually address it. And so we can't just imagine that there's a ghost population that people look over. No, minimum wage is great, but if you don't have access to minimum wage, that's even bigger problem. And so,
Yes.
again, I'm gonna make sure that you have my information and book on me. Thank you for being bold enough to ask the question. Now we can support you.
Thanks, Pat. And
Okay, thank
I'll
you so
connect
much.
you guys. We'll make sure that you guys connect. We are at time, and I want to thank our panelists, but I also want to remind us that there are things that individuals can do, right? But ultimately, the only way to get ourselves out of this is through policy and systems level change, by putting the pressure on employers when we need to put pressure on employers, by putting pressure on legislators when they need to be making the right decision for all of our benefits as elected officials. So, let's not stop the conversation at the individual level, because there is so much more work to do. So I will end it there. Thank you all. Thank you, our panelists. Thank you, audience members, for joining us.